Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mach.
So today I'm talking with an amazing guest star, Shannon Lawrence. Shannon has been described as the true queen of horror, and she writes primarily horror, but some fantasy short stories. And she's also produced a non-fiction book titled The Business of Short Stories, Writing, Submitting, Publishing and Marketing, which I'm sure will interest our listeners because a lot, including me, haven't really tried their hand at short stories. And she explains why an author should try some short stories, and also the pros and cons of story writing. She also submits a lot of stories to anthologies and magazines, so we discuss the best way to do that. If an author is thinking about doing that, should give some tips. And of course, we talk about creating horror, how to create something that is spine-chilling and creepy. We also talk about just general creativity, about what other pastimes an author can take up, which will help with perhaps refreshing their mental imagery before they go back to the desk and start typing out. And we also talk about her writers support group and about her podcast and about writers conferences. So it's a bumper show packed with lots of interesting things that I'm sure that fantasy authors will be very, very delighted to hear. And Shannon is a lovely guest, very entertaining. So without further ado, let's go straight over to Colorado Springs and speak with Shannon Lawrence. Hello.
Hello. All right.
There we are.
Yeah.
We're going. So it's just coming up to 9 o'clock in the morning here in London, England. I'm just west of London, actually. I'm near Windsor Castle. And where are you?
I'm almost in the center of the country. I'm in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
Oh, wow. I've never been to. Oh, wow. That's kind of cowboy country, isn't it?
This town isn't very cowboy-y, but if we go out, if we push out into the rural areas, we start hitting the ranches and stuff. Yeah.
Isn't that where Tesla was based? Wasn't he doing his Frankenstein experiments there in Colorado?
Oh yes, Tesla,
yeah.
The actual real Nikola
Tesla.
Yes.
Wow.
I actually belong to a writers group here that was named after Tesla for speculative fiction. So.
Oh, that's good. Well, they are. Brilliant link there with kind of science fiction-y fantasy and horror, I think.
Yeah, it's perfect.
So I was just, before you came on there, I was just going through a little bit about you and explaining what you're about, because you've been described as the true queen of horror, and you write primarily short stories of horror and fantasy. What I wanted to know was, what's your background? Have you got, for example, a medical background or a mortuary background or a police crime scene background? How did you get into that genre?
I don't have any background like that, but I've had a quite an interesting life. So that probably led me to like true crime and to get into reading horror and stuff. Oh, right. So I had somebody try and kidnap me when I was little. I was in the car when a serial killer came after my mom.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like 3. I don't remember it. But yeah. So I think that with that going on, I couldn't help but get into this sort of thing.
Wow. Well, that's a great answer. You didn't have to go into that deep, but thank you. So do you remember the first horror story that you ever read? And if so, how did that impact on you?
So I would say I grew up on the East Coast for a while.
Okay.
And because so I'm in Colorado now, right? And westward expansion happened a little later. So there's a lot of history when you live on the East Coast, comparatively. Nothing like Europe, but
no, but that's where your history is. Yeah.
Right. And so there ghost stories galore. And it was just such an active part of the culture. And then I started reading all the cool ghost stories. And then I started reading like the kid ones, and one that stuck with me, and I don't know who the author is, but it was in a book for young adults probably. And it was called Taily Poe. And I've seen it kind of pop up here and there. So I don't know how old that story is, but it was a nice, creepy story. And I started just gobbling down all of these anthologies, right? And collections and everything of short stories. And then I found Stephen King, and then it was all, it was all over that.
That's where it all starts. Yeah.
Yes, I know. You definitely are right.
So straight away lured by short stories, the anthology collections was what you were looking at.
Yeah.
Even Stephen King, who writes novels, he writes novelettes, doesn't he? Because they're easy to consume.
He does. And he has a bunch of, collections of short stories too. He's kind of he's in general a master, of course, in horror, but he's really skilled in short stories, and not everybody can say that they're good at both. No. And even people who don't like his books at this point, because he's reached that point where they're like, they're door stoppers, still enjoy his short fiction, including short stories and novelettes and all that good stuff. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. How old were you when you decided to write your own short story? Can you remember that?
I remember doing it in elementary school because I had a teacher. I was lucky. I had my 5th grade teacher. Something she did to get us engaged. I was kind of in a low income, kind of gang-ridden elementary school when I lived on the East Coast, but she brought out the creativity. She just cut out pictures from magazines and stuff like that, and she'd bring them in and she'd spread them out, and we would each go up and grab whatever spoke to us, right? And then she'd tell us, sit down and write about that picture, whatever comes up, and it could be a picture of the Earth. I remember there just being like a picture of Earth from space, and then there's one might have 2 people in it and you're figuring out what they're saying. But yeah, she just set us free. And so that's the first time I remember doing that. And I've had some really excellent English teachers that did a lot with writing. So
thank goodness.
I was lucky. Yeah. Because a lot of kids don't get that.
No, they don't. And do you remember the first time that you wrote for an audience? Because those, even in class, you're writing for yourself and for your teacher. Can you remember the first time you wrote for an audience?
Yeah, it would have been in 8th grade.
Right.
So I wrote this. I don't do this anymore, but I wrote an opera. So I was in a writing club under this one teacher, and she published her first book that she'd researched for decades, a couple of years ago. But she was big on writing, and so she had a writing club, and I was in that club, and she made an opera writing club, and I was like, meh, because I didn't know music or anything. And then she came to me, and she was like, we need a little help with somebody to kind of get us started. And so she invited me to that group, and I ended up writing this opera that got picked up by a group called the Imagination Celebration, which in this area, it was affiliated with the library for a long time, but they inspire all the arts, and they encourage that. And they did all these neat programs. And so it got performed. It was on the news. That was pretty cool. Yeah.
Very cool. So that's the libretto you wrote, or did you write the whole thing, your music and libretto?
So I wrote the words, and then what I would do, I could play by ear pretty well. And so I would do that. And somebody who could actually write music, actually wrote the music down from it. And we just played off each other. It was myself, the teacher, and one other student who did the music portions, just one day at the teacher's house. So, yeah.
That's a fantastic story. Thank you. So, of course, opera is melodramatic, isn't it? It's famous for being over the top, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
although, I mean, I'm an opera fanatic, but I've not actually seen a blood and gore opera. I think there's a space for that. I mean, we need to bring that in.
We should. Yeah, it needs to happen because, again, with the drama and all of that, it would be perfect.
Yeah. So I've been looking through your works, and I thought what we could do is just go through some of the things that you've written. And one thing I picked up to start with was that you wrote Blue Mist for a compilation. I think it's a story collection called In the Deep Dark Woods. Do you remember that?
Yes. Yeah.
So could you tell us about the Blue Mist? Yeah.
I actually based that one on kind of I guess it's lore around a city that's north of me and it's higher up in the mountains called Estes Park. And they kept saying, oh, there's this mysterious blue mist and people are so freaked out by it. And I was like, okay, but what does it do? And they're like, oh, I don't know, it's scary. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to write a story about what happens in the blue mist then. And so that was fun because I got to base that on lore that it was so shallow, right? It was just like there's a scary mist, and I'm like, well, it's mountains. There's gonna be fog, you guys. So
yeah, mist is blue, isn't it? Often.
That's right. So it's the lights, whatever. So yeah, it was fun to actually put a story to that.
So actually, really, in a way, that you have created the folklore for it, because the scary thing existed, but there's no actual lore to make that real.
Isn't that
so
right?
You had to write it using
it made me wonder how much lore is out there that it's just like, oh, and then there's that scary forest, and you're like, yeah, tell me more. And they're like, no, it's just a scary forest. That's all. I don't know.
So did you ever go up there and look at this blue mist or not? Did you bother to do that?
Oh,
I don't mean that in a bad way. Yeah, all right.
So the hotel that's in Estes Park is where the hotel is that Stephen King wrote The Shining.
Well, that makes sense.
So that's the Stanley Hotel. It's not Kubrick.
Oh, further Stanley Hotel. Yeah.
Yeah. So Kubrick, the movie that Kubrick did actually was set. They used a hotel in Oregon.
Oh, right.
So they didn't use the hotel. It was
right.
But yeah, I stay up there. And in fact, I used to do once a year. I would go up there in like February, so it's off season for tourists, and just hang out. And so yeah, snow and mist and all of that, and you're in a technically haunted hotel, and it's perfect for a writing weekend.
Yeah, we had a guest on the show last year who was a paranormal investigator, but a proper scientific one, with master's degree in physics and things like that. And they did one of their shows from there. So yeah.
Did they get anything?
Oh yeah, they always get something. Oh yeah.
It's supposed to be super active. I went on a ghost tour there, and it was fun. They turned off the lights, and people were supposed to put these dumb suckers on their hands. And then when the lights came back on, some of them were standing up and all that good stuff.
Yeah. That's what this lady does. They set up a whole load of camera traps. They have a thing called a laser camera, which fires thousands of little pinprick lasers. But then you can see a black shape go across the laser beams, which is impossible because how can it? Because nothing can be there, and they've got PIR lights, so that it proves that there's no actual red-blooded thing. So whatever went across these laser beams wasn't human or wasn't alive. Wow.
It's pretty cool. Yeah,
I love all that sort of stuff. About the audience that you're writing for, do you want those people to be horror junkies, or would you say that any reader can dip into your short stories and can become thrilled?
By virtue of, I think probably any horror author has family and the like and friends who will get the books and read them just because they're yours, or the magazines that I'm in, who will read it. And I hear all kinds of varied things on that, because so horror, it has to have an ending, and it has to be a, satisfying ending, but it doesn't have to be a happy ending. So I've heard about that from people who are very upset about that, who don't usually read horror.
Right.
And I'm like, listen, that's just the way it goes. I'm sorry. But so I tend to consider my horror kind of blue collar horror. So I'm not doing the deep literary horror most of the time or anything like that. And I'm just having fun with it. So for the most part, horror people are going to be the ones who want to read it. But I also have psychological horror out that's anybody can read it. And there's not, monsters, ghouls, whatever in that.
Yeah.
But
because I think that's what listeners might be interested in. Say, for example, they've embarked on a fantasy, so this is a fantasy authors podcast. They've embarked on the fantasy, but they want a little bit of scariness in it, edginess in it.
Yeah.
I think somebody like you would be interesting to hear what tips you'd suggest to somebody who doesn't want to write a horror, but they want to have a fantasy, but with elements of scare in it. What would you recommend? What's some of your best tips?
Well, so I was so excited when urban fantasy came out, and basically now, of course, they call it contemporary fantasy a lot of the time now, because urban has to be set in a city and there's strict rules. But really, those of us who read it kind of have a feel rather than the city having to be the character. But I think that's a really good entryway for somebody who wants to write horror, is to read the urban fantasy like Kim Harrison and Kelly Armstrong and, well, so many, Patricia Briggs, because they've taken the horror elements and they've put them in fantasy and made them just the things that people live with all the time. I remember just being so excited, and I think Laurel K. Hamilton was the first one I read, and I just devoured her books for a while because I was like, it's horror, but it's not horror.
Yeah.
So I'd call that a gateway.
Gateway drug into
yes, that's
horror.
Right. To getting to horror, but horror elements for your fantasy.
Yeah, that makes sense. I 100% understand what you mean, because I've written a trilogy of books which I consider to be just contemporary fantasy. But Amazon, when you put stuff on Amazon, they tend to, so you can choose your own genres, but they also give you, sometimes if you're lucky, they give you another genre, and they put my first book under horror. And I was really surprised. And it has got bits in it, with ghosts, and there's a beast which attacks people, but I never thought it was horror. And now, but of course, they've now put it under that category. It means that horror readers will buy it, I suppose.
Yeah.
And you thought, wow, I hadn't thought of that. So I suppose that can happen. There is a crossover, there's no doubt at all, between that contemporary fantasy and, you're right, and the beginnings of horror. You don't have to be a horror junkie to love it. No,
because we all love our critters. We love our
exactly.
evil beings or whatever like that.
Exactly. This is where the whole Lovecraft bit comes into it, isn't it? It extends into nightmares, and those nightmares always have horrible things lurking.
Oh yeah. Lovecraft himself had night terrors. Basically, he called them night gaunts, and I was fascinated by that because I've had my share of night terrors with the person standing over me when I wake up, and sleep paralysis and all that. So when I found those, that was a lot of fun. Just, hey, there's a connection there. I don't want to connect everywhere with H.P. Lovecraft because that's problematic. But yeah, the night gaunts, I was like, this is exactly what it is.
Yeah.
They're night gaunts.
So let's talk a bit about shorts then, because your stories are found in about 40 or so anthologies and magazines. Is that your preferred way to publish your work? And if so, why?
It is. I've written a couple books, and I'm terrible at submitting them, which is so funny, and querying them, because I love the roller coaster of short stories. It's so much faster. It's a faster world than novels. And if I get published in a magazine, I could be published the next month, because magazines tend to go faster, right? Unless it's a quarterly. And then if I'm in an anthology, then that one will usually take a few months to come out, and sometimes a year or whatever. But I think I got a little addicted to that rapid, because I'm having to do the work to submit so much more. And yet I'm like, I'll get to the novel stuff in a little bit. So I do just enjoy the more immediate payoffs, and that might be explained because I do have ADHD. I have been diagnosed with ADHD, so it actually makes a lot of sense for me. But I wrote a nonfiction book, and it was no problem because I've taught. It's about short stories, and I've taught workshops for years on short stories. So that was a whiz to write. Yeah, I just enjoy, you can write faster with a short story, and then you can get it edited faster, and then you can submit.
I totally understand that. My other role is journalist, so obviously we're working on deadlines the entire time. You get given press release, which is about 100 rubbishy words. You've got to do some investigation and write a piece, 1,500 words, and write it tomorrow sort of thing. So I'm used to the deadline thing. So I get that. I also see the other side of it as a fiction writer and a novelist. I'm working concurrently with about 3 edits all the time, as well as publishing, because you keep having to bring the next book to the market, don't you? So you're constantly working on it. I mean, obviously not like your teacher, it doesn't take me 20 years, but it takes probably, I would think, 12 months possibly to get it to market from the rough hewn object that it starts as. So I fully understand that. Although I've never, even though people keep advising me to, I've never attempted to write a short story. So
okay,
that's just me. We'll talk about your non-fiction book in a second, but how would you persuade somebody like me to write a couple of short stories?
To write a short story? Well, it's one of the things I find when people ask a lot, every time I sit down to write a short story, it becomes a novel. And so my big thing with that is that it was never a short story to start with. You sat down with a novel idea. And so one of the things that people have found, okay, wait, I can do that, is when I've suggested, why don't you take one of your characters or a set of your characters from one of your novels and write a little side thing about them, write about a little side mission or something like that, and see what you can do without all the big story threads that are attached to a novel, and see if you can write a short story about your characters. And then you can actually use that as a reader magnet or to put out free newsletter. There's all kinds of ways to use it. So
what a great tip. I love that.
Because there might be things that don't fit into a novel or little ideas you've had that you've tossed, and then it might work for a short story. And
I think that will help actually create stronger and more durable characters anyway, wouldn't it? Because you're examining them under a microscope. Well,
that's a big thing. It helps with backstory too. Like if you have backstory that you don't want to put into the book, but you maybe reach a point where you're like, I haven't really examined what this is. You could write just about that on a short story form.
That's true.
And flesh it out a little bit. And then it doesn't have to go in there, but
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You're telling yourself the backstory.
Yeah.
So this non-fiction book, it's called The Business of Short Stories, Writing, Submitting, Publishing and Marketing. What inspired you to write that then? What was the inspiration?
So locally, at least, everybody else is writing novels. And I was going to writers' conferences and I was constantly being asked to do, you write short stories, do a workshop for us.
Yeah.
And I got it a little more attention around here so that it was becoming that at all of the cons and the conferences here now, there's always something about short stories. It doesn't mean I'm the one teaching it, but they realized that people wanted that because those classes were always full when I did them. And I wasn't anybody. They weren't coming because I was a big author. They were coming because they were interested in that. And so the more I reached out, so I have a blog too, and it's the same thing. And there's a great blogging community, but most of them are novelists. And then even the ones who do write short stories, their focus is the novels, but at least we can chat about short stories sometimes. And again, they started showing that interest. Like on my website, each month I'll post how many submissions I've made, how many acceptances, how many rejections, because I want people to see when you're doing short stories, you get more rejections than you do acceptances. It doesn't matter how many you've got published. Yeah. So I want them to see so people don't get discouraged, because that's a big thing, right? With people, they try that short story for the first time, they submit that short story, it gets rejected by, 3 markets. And then they're like, well, I can't write short stories then, but it's not true. So you got to find the editor that likes it, just like with a book. Everybody has different taste.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The anthologies side of it, in your nonfiction book, do you go into that about submitting to anthology collections or?
Oh yeah. So magazines and anthologies, because there is a difference and there's different reasons to be in them, and it's a different experience. Because again, magazines more rapid, anthologies more spread out, and really anthologies are frequently indie publishers or smaller publishing houses that are putting those out to get more attention to their publishing house and to their authors that are doing novels too. So they're going to market them, and that gets you out there.
Well, it makes sense. you've also written 3 short story collections yourself, where you've produced. So tell us about Blue Sludge Blues and other abominations.
And other Blue Sludge Blues and other abominations.
Great title, by the way. So, yeah, tell us about that then.
So that one, the title story in that, there's a story behind that. But I wanted to try to use all the squicky words. People don't like the word moist, for example. And I was like, I wonder if you could write a story that just hits on these words that get, like, crawl up people's backs. And so it ended up being set in a porta potty kind of setup, like a rest stop, hole in the ground toilet thing. And there's a creature. And I love that story. And I read it before it was all the way done. I didn't have an ending on it yet, but I needed something to read. And I was like, let's see how people react to this. And so it was a room full of people, and I read it, and their reactions just were making me laugh. It was fantastic. It felt great. But it ended up getting bought by a magazine, and it was the one people kept asking me about. I heard you wrote a porta potty story. And so they kept asking about that story. And to this day, I get private messages and texts and all sorts of stuff every time somebody has to use a porta potty, portable toilet at a fair or anything like that. And I just get a message that says, I hate you, with a picture of whatever the toilet is that they have to use. And I'm like, well, if that's what you want to remember me by, that's awesome. Let's do it.
It's a primeval fear, isn't it? Because, when you're doing your business, you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable. So whatever animal you are, something can attack you. There's spiders in Australia, isn't there, which jump out of the toilet rim. In this country, they always say that the reason they have the lids on toilets is to stop rats coming up. Apparently, a rat can go up through the sewer, and that's why you have a lid on it. But when you get to those portable ones, or the ones which are in big public places, they don't have, snakes, but they don't have tops on those.
No, it's freaky. And then when it's just a hole in the ground, you're like, I can't see. There's not like a tiny hole at the bottom. It's just this massive hole that goes down into this roomy space, and it's freaky.
Yeah.
Never liked it. And I grew up my uncle was in the army in Vietnam, for example, and he had stories about the fears of somebody hiding in the latrines and
they would, wouldn't they?
Stabbing up, right? And I was like, there's so many things, but you're so vulnerable when you're sleeping, when you're showering, when you're on the toilet.
That's the places where it's going to happen. Horror will happen.
That's right. and my job is to make people feel as uncomfortable as possible when they're doing those normal things.
I love that. I mean, we talked about writing, and I suppose we should say that, ask, because I think most listeners are interested in this sort of thing. Do you have a proper regime? Do you wake up and do 6 hours writing? How does it actually work for you, the writing day?
I don't. I call myself a sprint writer, whatever that might mean to people.
Yeah.
But I'll go days without writing, and then I'll sit down and I can produce a lot in a short period of time because, of course, it's been in my head for those days. It's not like I just sit down, but here you go, sit down and it's been there. And so I know where I'm going, and then I'm just going to vomit that out. But I can write really fast when I do it, and then run out or whatever, or have to go to bed. And then it might be a couple more days, or I might write a couple days in a row. So no, I'm very sporadic. I could probably get a lot more done if I did a Stephen King, like 8 to 5
There's
job
nobody
of it.
like him. There's nobody like him, though.
No.
So I read that one of your pastimes was photography, and you go out and sort of take some nice pictures. Do you think that other pastimes or other passions over and above our writing perhaps help us to keep fresh and maybe helps our mental imagery? Do you think it's helpful for writers to have other passions?
I think so. And especially if it's something creative that you can love, that it helps if you're not focusing all the time. Writing can become such a job.
It is.
That sometimes your brain just needs to be reminded that this is about your creativity. This is have fun with it. Open up that part of it. Yeah. And I found like hiking And that's when I take a lot of my pictures, is when I'm hiking.
Right.
But even going for a walk around the neighborhood, man, I can fix a story problem so much better than if I'm sitting in front of a computer,
Yeah, me too.
But yeah, going on that hike and then taking pictures, I'm not going to say I'm a professional. That's not, but I love to take them and to get those great shots later. So much easier with digital cameras.
It is. Yeah.
I started with a 110 camera, and if you get back whatever, you get back those 24 pictures or whatever, and they're not, here's a blur. That one's my thumb.
Yeah.
I got a picture of the water with that one. That's good. So, but even for, say, photography, you're seeing that picture to begin with, and then you have to be open to, well, what would look good if I were to cut this down and then take that one single picture?
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of like short story stuff as well, isn't it? Because you're doing a story, but an image story.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any other pastimes or do you do any craft or anything?
I'm one of those people who wishes they could be crafty. I watch my friends do it. I learned how to crochet when I was a little kid, but I tried to relearn it, and I was like, yay, look at this half of a scarf that I made, and got lost interest in it. I still have that half a scarf downstairs somewhere because I really liked the colors of the yarn.
Well, at least that's something.
Yes. And so I do little things, but no, I'm not a crafty person. I love to see other people's craft though.
Oh, that's nice.
And gosh, I have so many creative friends. Yeah.
So talking about creative friends, what's the Insecure Writers Support Group then? Oh
yeah. So it's a blogging community.
Uh-huh.
And when I got started blogging, it was because everything, all the conference workshops, everything was, you must have a platform, get your platform set up before you're submitting. And I was like, okay. And so I started a blog having no idea what I was doing. And I found 2 challenges. One of them was called the A to Z challenge, and it just happens every April. And you have to post every weekday in April. I think it's every day but Sunday, in an alphabetical order.
Yeah.
So whatever theme. And that led me to the Insecure Writers Support Group. And it's really just a group of writers who are also bloggers who get together once a month. It's the first Wednesday of the month we post. And you can post about your insecurities, about whatever you're worried about. You can post, here's a concern I have with the writing world. What do you guys think? And there's authors that have many publications, and there's new authors on it. And it's this great mix. So yeah, we just post once a month, and if you don't have an insecurity that month, then you can post an inspiring post, for example, for those people who do. So
is there anybody who doesn't have an insecurity
in the writing world? Probably not.
Probably not.
There's always going to be something, because we have I just lost the word, but imposter syndrome, right? All the time. That's such a big writing thing. So we see that a lot in the posts.
Yeah. And the other thing is asking for money for something that I've created out of thin air. That's the other thing which I find difficult.
That's hard. That's really hard for writers, though. That's why in my nonfiction book, there's this big chunk of marketing, because I went and got a degree at the beginning. So I had a job when the pandemic started, and but it was for a restaurant, and I was doing bookkeeping, and I ended up having to also waitress and cook and dishwash in addition to being the bookkeeper for the restaurant, because we had staffers that couldn't work at the beginning, and then they had to quit and all this stuff. So I was doing all that. And then it came to a point where, because restaurants were hit so hard, that I was like, you guys, so I'm a bookkeeper, and I have to tell you that you can't afford me anymore. I don't think it's a reasonable expense for you. So I'm going to go ahead and give my notice. Yeah.
Give my notice to myself.
That's right.
Because I'm head of HR as well.
I was actually HR, yes. And I was a manager before that had even started. So I was doing it all. But yeah, I just reached a point where, all right, this isn't reasonable. So I said, what am I going to do right now? And I returned to school for my bachelor's, and I got it in business administration management with a marketing emphasis. Because I was like, I can use this as a writer too, but then I can get jobs with it.
Yeah.
So a lot of what I learned with the marketing stuff was eye-opening, and made it I still can't sit there and sell face-to-face somebody and say, that doesn't get easier, but it helped me to know that marketing isn't just selling.
No, it's making people understand or awareness,
That,
isn't it?
yes,
Yeah.
but even writing a story is marketing. Once you decide to write a story, what you've chosen to write is marketing, because it's going to appeal to somebody. But I think the big eye-opening thing for me was them saying that if somebody's looking for a book, they're looking for a product, they want your story. So all you're doing is telling them what your story is, and you're giving them what they want. If they buy it, that's what they wanted. You're providing that. And I was like, oh, I feel a little less gross about it now, but that helped me. And so it was like, I wanted to kind of get that out there to help other people too, because even as a kid, when it was go sell the candy bars and do this to raise money for school, I hated it with a passion. And I'd knock on 2 doors and then hate life and go back home. Because the first person that said no to me, I was like, okay, I'm out.
No. But at least with that, it's a tangible thing that somebody else has made. Yeah. I think it's more difficult with art because that it's come out of your imagination.
Out of your brain. Yeah.
Your brain. I've got this stuff that came out of my brain. Would you give me enough money to pay for a coffee?
Would you pay me to think up this stuff? Thank you. I appreciate it.
Have you got any other non-fiction books in the pipeline? Have you got anything else that you need to tell people? It does sound like you have.
I always have something in the works, but no, right now, in terms of nonfiction, I have a project that's probably a ways out that I'm kind of muddling in my brain first, because it's not something I've done forever, like short stories where I feel like I can be the authority.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's business related in that I found it really fun to learn about the differences in cultures that you have to learn if you're in business. And say, if I were to do business in Japan and then go to England and so on and so forth, every one of these countries has different customs. And so I was learning about those, and I was like, it'd be really useful to put together this type of information, like who shakes hands and who doesn't, for example, in a book for writers, so that they could flesh out characters if they have characters from another country, because there's so many errors made there, kind of, so like a kind of a thesaurus of customs and actions and stuff that are different. Because even how somebody looks, different countries won't meet the eyes, and some will, some won't, and so that's different too. And people mess that up in books all the time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really clever idea. Yeah, one of my favorite books, which I use all the time, is the negative traits thesaurus. So I love that. But so it would be like a thesaurus of customs and traditions and mannerisms, perhaps, from each country.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just feel like I started reading that and I was like, I'm sure if I went back through stories, if I ever put something, it's just not something I would have thought about.
So what's the podcast called? Mysteries, Monsters and Mayhem? What's all that about?
It's a true crime podcast. Again, another project I took on during the pandemic.
Oh, right.
And it was with a friend of mine who, when the pandemic hit, we had been for a local writers group running writers events.
Yeah.
And so we ran 4 different events per month that were free to attend. And then about every 3 months, we had a paid like half-day workshop thing. And so all these useful things. And suddenly that was all online. And then the end of our term had come up for that, and we decided not to renew. So I don't know, both of us apparently can't deal with not having a billion things to do. And so we formed a podcast about true crime and monsters, because it's mostly true crime, but we do cryptids and we do hauntings and stuff like that too, to kind of throw some fun in. And the mayhem really is just an excuse for us to, hey, we found this story entertaining and it's not a cryptid or a true crime, but we like it and we're going to say
it in anyway. Yeah,
it's our license. So
and who's the other person in this that you're talking about?
Her name is MB Partlow, and she is a fantasy author as well. She is not yet published. She was a journalist for a time, but she's not yet published, but she will be.
Oh, cool. And does that go out weekly or monthly? How's that?
It does. Every Wednesday we have a new episode.
Oh, lovely.
So, and it's really, there's a lot of humor to it, because I mean, again, we were the only people we were seeing other than our families when we were doing this podcast. So it starts with chat. And us just getting all this stuff out. And then we each cover a crime or whichever story we're doing. And then we have occasional guests.
I think that one of the best things about fiction, especially fantasy fiction and the world we operate in, which is imaginative, is how great the society is, the little mini culture we've got around us. You know, we're all helping each other. And I know, obviously, it's a lonely experience. And I know that people will be people who are listening to this who don't go out and they don't meet people. But there is ways of contacting other people, isn't there? There's a way of getting involved without having to necessarily see people face to face. And you do a lot of that, don't you? You create the ways to meet and to socialize.
Yeah, I think that was just a natural extension because I'd been doing the events for so long, because I'd done them alone before I did this with a partner. And I really, it's the same thing as a nonfiction book. I really found that I loved helping other writers. I could do that with the blogging community, and I could do that with the events and whatever I end up doing that with. But it really is different from other careers or jobs where people are competing. Because I mean, technically we're competing, but there's not a lot of authors that treat it that way.
No. You actually say, I'd like to be in that bookstore because there's so much competition.
That's right. And even when we query, for example, a novel, you have to put in comparative authors and books, right? So you're trying to lump yourself in with them. So you're working together even in that way, really. Who would I be on a shelf next to? Here's who is part of the query. So
and that goes back to the anthologies thing. Have you ever found that one of your stories that you've submitted to an anthology doesn't quite fit with the rest of the, because I suppose you have to read the other story. I don't know if you do. But
I mean, you don't have to.
You don't have to, but it would be nice.
I did start getting behind after a while because there was one year where it was really rapid and I sold really well. And I was like, I can't read them all. So eventually I'll work my way through them. I will say I haven't read the whole thing, but I feel like I was in I think it's called Fright into Flight. And it was a response to a book that came out, and there was one female author in it.
Oh, right.
It was a horror anthology with one female author, and she was in it because she was the editor.
Oh, crikey.
And so a publishing company, Word Horde, I believe, was like, well, that's not right, because there's plenty of women in horror that should be read too. And so they did an all-female version in response to it. And I sent a reprint. So for anybody who doesn't know what that is, once you've published a short story and given away those first rights to somebody, you get your rights back eventually. But if you were to submit it to another market, you have to tell them it's already been printed before, so it's a reprint.
Okay.
And some do take that. Some magazines and such will take reprints. So she was like, any women with stories about flying that are horror? And I said, yeah, I've got one that was already published. And I sent it to her and she was like, this is great. And she accepted and put it in there. Well, it was a pretty tame story.
Right.
And there are other people writing specifically for this anthology. Right. And so by the time I started seeing those, I was like, oh yeah, some of these stories were pretty more towards the extreme end of horror. And here's my nice little psychological horror piece. Yeah.
And now everybody's going to say, oh, well, that's typical of a woman to put a nice tidy piece in. Yeah,
that's right. And I'll be like, but listen, I have a porta potty story too. If you want that. But yeah, so it was to the theme and everything, but I don't know if it matched the mood unless there's other stories that were like that too.
Yeah, but I suppose a short story writer will never really know, if you're submitting to anthologies, how it's going to fit with the patchwork of ideas.
Well, and sometimes they don't know. A lot of the times editors are looking at what they got in and they start, all right, maybe there's this pattern that they start seeing in the stories they're liking. And sometimes just if somebody's been rejected, know that sometimes it could come down to something as simple as this had a pattern and you weren't in that pattern this time.
That's nice. That's a nice way of thinking about rejection.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many reasons you can get rejected. It helps a little. The more of those reasons, the easier it gets. And that was one of the things that I was lucky in what I did working. I helped put on a writers conference for a couple of years too, but I was getting to be just sitting down and talking to editors and agents as people instead of there being this pressure. And so I learned a lot from that. And I had friends who were slush readers for big magazines. Yeah. And the things they say, it's like, they're not rejecting stories because they're bad necessarily. Some are, but, but a lot of times it's simply, this doesn't fit with the mood of this particular publication, whatever that might be. So it's a little easier not to take it personally when you know that.
Yeah, up to a point. It's
Yes.
still the same as saying, you're not invited to the party because
That's right.
your face doesn't fit.
I'd be lying if I said that I don't still get those, where I'm like, but I really wanted to be in it.
Yeah.
What did I do wrong? Why don't you love me? So
yeah,
it's true. But a lot of them come in and I'm like, okay, next one. And I even know, sometimes I even have an idea, if this story gets rejected, I want to send it to this other one because it might fit there too. And so I already know, and then I send it out and it's business and it makes it easier.
So I saw that you were, I think, appearing at Pikes Peak Writers Conference. Is that right?
Yes.
So what's that about then?
It's in Colorado Springs, actually, and that's one that I've worked for in the past.
Right.
And I'm not working for it anymore. So it's kind of cool. This will be my first time getting to just be an author there and not an author and and an employee.
Yeah.
So they're a big one. It's known as it's often called the friendliest writers conference.
Oh, that's nice.
Because they have a big thing. For example, at lunches, the editors, agents, and writers each host a table. Mm-hmm. And so all lunches and dinners, but not breakfast, because some of us are cranky in the mornings. That would be bad. I certainly would be. I skip breakfast, but that's why I'm talking to you at 2 a.m. here. Right. I'm a night person.
Yeah.
And they encourage people, they give you a bunch of ways so that you can talk to them, and any of the professionals coming know that it's expected that they're going to be open to people talking to them and fielding elevator pitches and stuff like that.
I love it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's great. And they really are so open. And then it's called BarCon. At the end of the day, at any convention or conference, there's some sort of BarCon really, but yeah. Most of them will come down and hang out in that bar with people too and socialize. It's a different feel than I've had at other conferences.
Yeah, that does sound excellent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll put the links to that and your podcast onto my site. Where would listeners go if they wanted to follow you personally on social networks? Have you got any social network presence?
I do. So I have my website, which is thewarriormuse.com.
Warrior Muse, all one word.
Yes. Yep. And I've kind of branded everything underneath that. Okay. So while it was a mistake at the beginning, it's what I'm stuck with now, because usually you should brand under your name. Yeah. But it was well enough known that I couldn't get rid of it without losing something. But that's what I am on Twitter, for example, at the Warrior Muse. I'm trying to be more active on there, and I have been lately. I think I took like a year away from it and went, oh yeah, Twitter is a thing. Yeah. So I'm just starting out on TikTok, and I'm on Facebook under the Warrior Muse, but my name is on there as well, Shannon Lawrence. So I can be searched with either of those.
Okay, cool. And have you got any projects coming up that people should know about? Is there anything big in the pipeline ready to go?
I have delayed what was going to be my next one, which was going to be Happy Gula Days 2, because my last collection I put out was all holiday stories starting at Thanksgiving and going through Valentine's/Lupercalia. And so I wanted to do the rest of the year, and getting this nonfiction book out was a lot. Yeah. I threw myself into it, and I decided to put that one on hold until next year. So it's just, I have, it'll release any day now. I'm in Type House magazine with a short story, and I'm really excited about that because they invited me. So I'm part Native American, and they invited me to do something on murdered and missing Indigenous women, which in the US and Canada is a huge problem. And so they actually let me write a snippet of information for that. So I'm really excited about that, but it is a horror story. And it's actually, it's a really personal one. It deals with racism and it's horror. So it kind of has a happy ending and kind of doesn't. So I'm excited about that, and that'll be available on the various Amazons, and I know they're going a little wider, and their website, Type House Literary. And then I've got something coming out next in a few months. It's going to be called Particular Passages 2. Yay! I almost didn't have that, but I don't have a release date. And that, again, will just have one of my short stories in a collection with other authors.
All right. And where would you like people to go to buy your books? Where would you point them first? What place should they go?
Amazon's usually the easiest, I think, and it is available. Amazon UK, it's available all over the place. And I'm a little wider. It's on Smashwords, it's on Kobo, it's on all kinds of good places. But I think Amazon is the easiest one.
Did you see that they just recently announced that Smashwords have been taken over by Draft to Digital, or they've conglomerated?
They're combining, and so we're all waiting. I've been following that online because
it's interesting, isn't it? I've been with Smashwords for a long time. Although I've used the platform of Draft to Digital, I haven't really published to that, so that'd be an interesting combination for me.
I'm in the same place. I haven't. I do have an account just because one of my publications went through it, but that's it. And so I saw that and I'm like, but I have Smashwords down.
Yeah, exactly.
Please don't change it.
I don't know about you, but I started in the meat grinder days when you put something in, it took about an hour to put it into the system.
Oh my gosh. I've heard about that. I think I got lucky and came in at at the end of that. But I did start at CreateSpace, and then Amazon took them over, and that was not fun. I didn't like it.
No, I hated it. And I definitely lost stuff. I don't know what happened to it, but it disappeared in the sort of in the turmoil. Like a huge wind came in and smashed everything up, It
was just a nasty black hole. So they announced this and I went, oh no, why are you doing this to us? What did we do to you?
Well, congratulations on everything so far. Good luck with the Insecure Writers Support Group and the Mystery Monsters and Mayhem podcast. And that Pikes Peak Writers Conference does sound very, very good, very worthwhile. And good luck with everything in the future. Yeah. And by all means, come back and tell us if you've got new information or news to tell us or anything you would like to share, especially if it's to do with the learning and the craft of authorship, which is something we have to keep honing, don't we, the whole time?
Oh yeah, we should always be learning.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah.
Well, I don't know what time you go to bed, but I'm just about to have my breakfast now.
All right. Have a lovely day.
Thank you very much. It was lovely chatting to you. See you soon. Bye, Shannon. Bye. Bye.